October 13th, 1944, Northern Italy. An unarmed F-5E Lightning cuts through the pale autumn sky, engines throttling back as it descends toward a Luftwaffe-controlled airfield near Milan. German flak crews stand frozen. No one radios the usual warning. No one fires. The American twin-boom fighter glides in perfectly gear down, flaps deployed, as if this was its home base. When it touches the runway, men run for cover, convinced it's a trick, a captured plane rigged to explode. But the canopy opens, and out climbs an American pilot, hands raised, calm. "I speak fluent German. I've come to join you," he says. At that moment, the war stopped for everyone watching. An American officer flying an American aircraft had just defected to Nazi Germany. This isn't a rumor, it's documented history. His name was Martin James Monti, the only known US military officer to voluntarily serve in the Waffen-SS. Why would a 23-year-old from St. Louis risk everything, his rank, his country, his life, to join a regime that was already collapsing? That question would haunt investigators for decades. Before the war, St. Louis was a city of immigrants. German bakeries, Italian churches, flags of both nations still hang proudly from front porches. In 1927, Martin Monti was born into that blend German on his mother's side, Italian on his father's. At home, they spoke German more than English. Sunday dinners were loud, traditional, and full of talk about the old country. Neighbors later recalled the Monti family as very proud of their heritage. Nothing unusual about that until you realize what young Martin was listening to on the radio. During the 1930s, American airwaves carried more than swing music. They carried Father Coughlin's broadcast nationalist, anti-communist, sometimes openly pro-fascist. They carried news of Mussolini's marches and Hitler's so-called economic miracles. To a teenager obsessed with aviation and order, those voices didn't sound like threats. They sounded powerful. Monti began seeing the world through that lens: communism as chaos, strong leaders as saviors. By 1942, the United States was at war with both Germany and Italy. Thousands of German Americans proved their loyalty in uniform. Martin Monti also enlisted, but those early seeds of ideology didn't disappear. They simply went quiet. In the Army Air Forces, he trained as a pilot, competent but unremarkable. Fellow cadets described him as polite, distant, and strangely opinionated when politics came up. He called communism the real enemy and said the war in Europe was complicated. No one thought much of it then. But that quiet fixation on anti-communism would soon drive every choice he made. Because Martin Monti didn't just want to fly for America, he wanted to fly against the Soviets. And when it became clear that Washington planned to ally with Moscow rather than destroy it, something in him broke. By the summer of 1944, stationed thousands of miles away in British India, Martin Monti began to plan an escape. Not from war, but from his own side. By September 1944, the Allies were winning. Rome was liberated. Paris was free. Hitler's empire was crumbling from every direction. And yet, at a remote base near Karachi, still part of British India, Lieutenant Martin Monti was quietly preparing for the opposite journey. He didn't pack like a deserter. He packed like a man with a plan. Uniform pressed, identity papers intact, flight log meticulously updated. He signed out a jeep, drove off the base, and vanished. For weeks, military police across India circulated alerts: missing airman, possible accident. But there was no crash, no wreckage, no trace. Monti had slipped through Allied checkpoints using forged papers, claiming reassignment orders. From Karachi, he moved west, attaching himself to cargo convoys, hitching rides aboard transport planes, blending in with transient crews. Each step brought him closer to the Mediterranean to Italy, the only active front where German and American aircraft still shared the same sky. Think about that. He crossed 4,000 miles of active war zone without being stopped, questioned, or shot. That wasn't luck. That was calculation. Later investigations found something chilling in his notes. Sketched airfields, aircraft markings, radio frequencies. Evidence that he had studied, which bases handled reconnaissance, lightnings, the exact model he would later steal. By early October, he reached Naples, an Allied-controlled city thick with soldiers, mechanics, and supply officers. He kept his rank insignia visible, confident. In wartime chaos, one more lieutenant wandering between air depots drew little notice. Witnesses later said he had the look of someone always in motion, always with a purpose. That purpose would soon become clear. On October 13th, 1944, at the Pomigliano Air Base near Naples, an unarmed F-5E Lightning sat on the tarmac, freshly repaired and awaiting a test flight. Monti walked up to the maintenance chief, smiled, and said the words every overworked officer wanted to hear. "I can take her up for you." The chief glanced at his insignia lieutenant, Army Air Forces. Seemed legitimate. Paperwork was loose. No one questioned it. Minutes later, the twin Allison engines roared to life. Monti taxied down the runway, saluted the tower, and took off heading east, just as a test flight plan would indicate. But once he cleared the coast and disappeared from radar, he banked north. Past Allied lines, past the Gothic front, straight into enemy airspace. The man who had once sworn to defend his country was now steering its aircraft into the hands of its greatest enemy. The F-5E Lightning wasn't built for war, it was built for eyes. A reconnaissance version of the P-38, stripped of guns but packed with cameras. Light, fast, and able to fly over 1,000 miles without refueling. In other words, the perfect aircraft for a man trying to disappear across Europe. At 8:30 that morning, Monti lifted off into a cloudless Italian sky. His flight plan should have kept him within 50 miles of Naples. Instead, he climbed to 20,000 feet and aimed north toward the jagged silhouette of the Apennines. Down below, Allied troops advanced slowly up the boot of Italy. Above them, one of their own pilots was already crossing the line, engine throttled down to avoid radar. To survive this flight, Monti needed precision. Too low, and he risked Allied anti-aircraft fire. Too high, and German radar would mistake him for a bomber and shoot him down. He threaded the invisible corridor between enemies, flying what investigators later called a near-perfect infiltration route. That phrase alone told the story. This wasn't panic, it was a mission. Hours later, a Luftwaffe radar operator near Milan spotted the incoming blip. Single engine, high altitude, unusual pattern. Orders went out to intercept until someone noticed the silhouette. Twin booms, distinctive shape, lightning, they said, American Reconnaissance. Then came the shock. The Lightning dropped its landing gear. No bombs, no weapons. Just a white-nosed aircraft descending gently toward their airfield. Sirens wailed. Soldiers scrambled. Machine gunners aimed but held fire, uncertain whether this was surrender, sabotage, or madness. The plane touched down smoothly, rolled to a stop, and sat in silence. From the cockpit, an American stepped out, uniform immaculate, pistol holstered, hands raised high. He shouted in flawless German, "Nicht schießen! Ich bin ein Freund. Don't shoot, I'm a friend." The soldiers didn't move. Even by the standards of 1944, it was unthinkable. Why would an American pilot deliver himself like his aircraft to an enemy on the verge of defeat? When the Gestapo arrived, they ordered the plane inspected for explosives. Nothing. No trick. No hidden charges. Only then did they handcuff Monti and take him to headquarters. He smiled faintly as they led him away. In his mind, the hardest part was over. He'd crossed the line, and the Reich would surely welcome him. But the Germans weren't that naive. To them, this man was either a spy or insane. At the Luftwaffe command post near Milan, officers gathered around their unexpected visitor. His uniform was real. His papers checked out American issue. His aircraft, genuine and intact. Still, they didn't believe him. When asked why he came, Martin Monti didn't hesitate. He looked the German colonel in the eye and said, "I have come to join your fight against Bolshevism." The room went silent. Bolshevism, communisms, the word that unlocked everything for the Germans. If Monti's hatred of the Soviet Union was genuine, it could be useful. But first, they had to know whether he was lying. Over the next several weeks, Monti was interrogated at length by Abwehr and Gestapo officers. He was kept in isolation, questioned at odd hours, tested on every imaginable detail: his hometown, his flight school, his aircraft's mechanics, even German poetry. The results were unnerving. Monti spoke flawless German with a regional accent consistent with his family background. He knew German culture, politics, and military structure with eerie familiarity. Every story he told was held up under cross-checks. German intelligence began to suspect this wasn't a planted spy, it was a man who truly believed what he said. He told them he admired the discipline of the Third Reich. He despised America's alliance with the Soviets, and he saw the war as a tragic misunderstanding between two nations that should have been allies against communism. That line, almost word for word, mirrored Nazi propaganda broadcast in the United States before the war. He'd memorized it. I believed it. Finally, in November 1944, the German High Command approved his service offer. He was moved to Berlin, debriefed again, and then introduced to a new task: propaganda. Radio Berlin wanted him to speak directly to Allied soldiers, an authentic American voice denouncing Roosevelt, praising Germany, and warning that the real enemy is Moscow. It was supposed to be the perfect psychological weapon. But there was one problem. Martin Monti was terrible at it. Recordings later recovered show a flat, awkward delivery, part sermon, part lecture. He stumbled over words. He sounded unsure. Even German staff joked that the American sounds bored with his own betrayal. His broadcasts had no measurable effect. No Allied units reported morale issues after hearing him. Within weeks, Berlin radio dropped him. But to the SS, failure on the airwaves didn't mean failure of loyalty. If he couldn't fight with words, he could still fight with a rifle. By December, Monti was transferred again, this time to the Waffen-SS. There, under the alias Martin Wiethaupt, he took the oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler. This wasn't symbolic, it was personal. He stood before an officer, raised his hand, and swore, "I vow obedience unto death to the Führer of the German Reich and people." That moment, the instant his hand came down, marked him forever. He wasn't a deserter anymore, he was an American Nazi. By the winter of 1944, Germany was dying. Cities burned nightly. Rail lines shattered. The Ardennes offensive was failing in the snow. And yet, amid that chaos, a single American lieutenant, now calling himself Martin Wiethaupt, issued black SS fatigues and a new serial number. The SS didn't hand out uniforms lightly. Joining wasn't just military, it was ideological. It meant pledging not to a nation, but to a doctrine of racial supremacy and total loyalty to Hitler. So why did they accept him? Desperation. By late 1944, the Third Reich would take anyone who could speak, shoot, or broadcast their message. And Monti, with his perfect American accent, was a propaganda gift too rare to waste. He was attached to SS Standarte Kurt Eggers, a unit known for psychological warfare filming, writing, and broadcasting Nazi messages to enemy forces. They were the voice of the Reich's last delusion, that if the Allies could just be convinced to turn against the Soviets, Germany might somehow survive. To that fantasy, Monti lent his voice. Under the name Wiethaupt, he translated American communiques, wrote leaflets, and helped prepare German-language broadcasts aimed at American POW camps. Some historians claim he even reviewed captured Allied footage for intelligence value. His fellow SS men distrusted him but tolerated him. To them, he was a curiosity, a traitor who had chosen the losing side. A man they didn't admire, but one they could use. Still, there was one undeniable fact. He was there voluntarily. German pay records show he received wages for his work, actual Reichsmarks, signed off by SS payroll officers. His name appeared in the files alongside the oath, the alias, and the signature of his commanding officer. By early 1945, when the Reich was nothing but rubble and rumor, Monti was still serving. The Soviets were at the gates of Berlin. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, and yet reports place Monti assisting in SS information detachments until the final weeks of the war. He'd tied himself completely to a corpse of an empire. Then came May 8th, 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender. For the German nation, it was the end. For Martin Monti, it was the beginning of a nightmare. He was now a man without a country, an American officer in SS uniform, standing in the ruins of the Third Reich. The war had ended, but for him, the reckoning had just begun. May 1945. All across Europe, men in uniform burned their insignia, buried papers, and prayed not to be recognized. Among them, one man in an American flight jacket stepped carefully through the wreckage of northern Italy. He wasn't running from the Germans, he was running to the Americans. Martin Monti walked into a U.S. command post near Milan and calmly surrendered. To the weary officers processing thousands of soldiers, refugees, and defectors, he was just another lost pilot trying to get home. And he had a story ready, perfectly rehearsed, half true and convincing. He said he'd stolen an unarmed Lightning for a special reconnaissance mission, but got lost in cloud cover, ran out of fuel, and was forced to land in German territory. Once there, he'd been captured and forced to make propaganda broadcasts under threat of execution. Every word of his cooperation, he said, had been coerced. He'd never betrayed anyone willingly. It was a bold lie because the truth was buried in German files no American investigator could yet access. The war had just ended. Archives were scattered. Communication between Allied intelligence branches chaotic. So, for now, his story held. He was interrogated briefly, then sent to a detention facility as a suspected deserter, but not a traitor. The paperwork charged him with theft of government property and absence without leave. No mention of treason. No mention of the SS. The maximum penalty could have been death, but the judges saw something else. A young, shaken pilot who'd made a foolish mistake. They sentenced him to 15 years of hard labor, lenient by wartime standards. Even that didn't last. Just 6 months later, in February 1946, President Harry S. Truman granted him clemency after a Missouri congressman intervened. The official petition described Monti as a confused young man who had strayed under the strain of war. Truman agreed, reducing his sentence and allowing him to re-enlist in the Army Air Forces. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? A man who had worked for Hitler's SS being welcomed back into the US military. But that's how broken the post-war system was, fragmented, overloaded, and unaware of the evidence piling up overseas. So on February 11th, 1947, Monti put on a uniform again, this time as a low-ranking private at Mitchell Field, New York. He smiled in his enlistment photo. The traitor had come home. For almost a year, he lived as a model airman, quiet, punctual, respectful. He blended in completely. But across the ocean, archivists and investigators were piecing together the puzzle his lies couldn't hide forever. And the walls were closing in. By 1948, the world had moved on. The Nuremberg trials were over, the Cold War had begun, but in dusty American intelligence offices, old German files were finally being translated, and one name kept appearing again and again: Martin James Monti. In propaganda transcripts, in SS payroll ledgers, in interrogation reports recovered from Berlin. Everywhere investigators looked, the same story emerged. He hadn't been a prisoner. He had been a volunteer. FBI agents began tracing his movements. They found his radio broadcasts logged under Martin Wiethaupt. They found SS forms bearing his signature. And they found the most damning evidence of all: his oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler. The facade collapsed overnight. On January 26, 1948, moments after Monti's honorable discharge from the Air Force at Mitchell Field, New York, agents closed in. He was arrested before he even reached the base gate. The headlines came days later: American officer charged with treason. For the first time since the Civil War, a U.S. military man faced the ultimate accusation: betrayal of his nation in wartime. The evidence was overwhelming. 21 counts of treason, each one tied to a specific act: voluntary propaganda, collaboration, military service, under the SS banner. His defense team tried everything. They claimed coercion. They claimed mental instability. At one point, they even floated the bizarre idea that he had been secretly working on a plan to assassinate Hitler from the inside. But the documents didn't lie. Every payment stub, every signature, every radio script reinforced the truth. On January 17, 1949, Martin James Monti stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to all 21 counts. Not to save face, not out of remorse, but because the mountain of evidence left him no escape. The judge could have sentenced him to death. Treason carried that right. But instead, the court imposed 25 years in prison, a $10,000 fine, and a dishonorable discharge. Why spare him? Historians believe the timing mattered. By 1949, the U.S. wanted to project moral superiority in a world divided between democracy and dictatorship. Executing a young American, especially one already punished once, might have sent the wrong signal. So Monti lived. He served 12 years behind bars, staging hunger strikes, filing appeals, and trying to withdraw his guilty plea. He was denied every time. In 1960, he walked free on parole. He was 40 years old, half his life already lost to the consequences of a single delusion. After his release, Martin James Monti vanished quietly into the American landscape he had once betrayed. No interviews. No public apologies, just a man in Florida, living under his real name, collecting his thoughts and fading into obscurity. Neighbors later described him as polite but strange. He rarely discussed his past. When asked about the war, he claimed he'd been misunderstood. He died in the year 2000 at the age of 76. And was buried back in Missouri, just miles from where his fascination with power and ideology had begun. No military honors, no public service record, just a headstone marked with his name and the silence of history closing over it. But his case didn't vanish. In military law schools, United States versus Monti remains a landmark, the first conviction of an American officer for treason against his own country during World War II. His story exposed catastrophic failures in post-war record sharing, the fragility of military justice amid chaos, and the uncomfortable truth that betrayal can hide behind the calmest faces. Even now, historians and intelligence officers study his file, not just for what he did, but for what the system missed. Had German documents been shared faster, had agencies coordinated better, Monti might have faced the firing squad in 1945 instead of parole in 1960. His life is a study in contradictions. An officer who swore 2 oaths to the United States, one to Adolf Hitler. A man who risked everything for an ideology he couldn't even articulate, clearly after the war. And a reminder that betrayal doesn't always come from the enemy's side of the battlefield. In the end, Martin Monti's defection wasn't just a story of treason. It was a story of misplaced belief, of a mind twisted by propaganda, and of a moment in history when even the victors struggled to see clearly through the fog of peace. He remains, to this day, the only American military officer ever known to have joined Nazi Germany voluntarily. A man who crossed the line twice and almost got away with it.